All right, all right, all right. Hello, Detroit. Okay. Sorry, I was born with a defective sense of humor. So, what we're going to talk about over the next hour and 15 minutes is a style of programming that many people use, but it's going to be new to a lot of the people who have been working in the SharePoint space, especially developers. I think some of you have kind of been seeing the writing on the wall, over the last couple months, and some people kind of found out this week, that the big Microsoft strategy has moved to apps. And what does that mean? You've been writing code that runs on the server for the last 5 years, and now they tell you all the rules have changed. And you're not supposed to run code on the SharePoint server. You're supposed to run code that runs inside the browser and runs over, across the wire in your own remote web. So what we see now is that all these skills, that we really could get by without, are now very essential in terms of, client-side development. So that's what the gist of this talk is all about. So we're going to start by just looking at some of the fundamentals of REST. What is REST? What are the things I really have to keep in mind? We're going to be using a couple different utilities along the way. In particular, Fiddler and the IE developer tools. I want to make sure that people have a pretty firm understanding of those. And then we're going to move over and talk about OData. And we'll just start with just the fundamentals of what is OData. We'll take a quick look at the spec. We'll take a look at how we run queries that have things like where clauses and order by clauses inside them. We'll do, hopefully, plenty of work with writing code, both in JavaScript and C# that uses REST and OData. And then we'll finish up with a quick discussion of OAuth. But the OAuth discussion will be pretty brief because the next two sessions I'm doing right after this, both in two different rooms other than this, by the way, are going to be basically based on OAuth. So I'm just going to probably spend about 5 minutes at the end kind of introducing what OAuth is and spend more time on the other things that I'm not covering in other sessions. Okay. Now, let's go back to a different time, different place. Gosh, I remember it was back in 1995. I started working with this company called Developmentor. I remember that year. That was the year that people, waited overnight for Windows 95. And if people tell you that Apple created the idea of making their customers pathetically stand in line overnight, no, it was Microsoft, way back 17 years ago. So anyway, I worked with all these guys that have really, really big brains. You got Don Box, Chris Sells, Tim Ewald, Keith Brown, Fritz Onion, Aaron Sconard. And I guess I kind of felt I had the teeny brain. Well, actually, I had Jason Masterman and Brian Randall with me. We were the VB guys, and they always made jokes that we were the remedial guys. But there was some dysfunction there, and the dysfunction, was really caused by smartest guy in the room syndrome. Everyone had to be so super smart. Okay, now it turned out that Don went off to Microsoft, and as he was at Developmentor Microsoft, he started working on this specification, which is called SOAP, which at first was named Simple Object Access Protocol. Now, Don's background was COM, and then .NET was a very new thing in town. Before that, here's a history lesson, sorry. But back in the 90s, we had COM over on the Microsoft side, and the other side had Corva, and we'd argue which one was better, and history showed that they were both kind of stupid, and they both went away. But we had this issue where Don and about 5 guys, went and created this protocol, Simple Object Access Protocol, and it's just so ironic that they put simple at the front of that. Because it was over-engineered. So they're thinking, okay, for hello world, obviously we have to take this object graph of a collection of customers and invoices and invoice details, and we need to be able to basically put them across the network and basically rehydrate them on the other side. So one of the things that people figured out when they used SOAP is it just was really, really hard. It was the opposite of simple. So they didn't use the standard HTTP verbs. They created their own HTTP verbs. Problems with firewalls. And then you had just to parse together tons of XML. And you had to put it inside the body and inside the headers. So it just became a very hard thing to use. So then, I guess about 2005, 2006, I heard all these people, giving me this advice. Don't use SOAP. You need rest. Don't use SOAP. You need rest. So after sleeping until noon and not showering for a year, my software didn't get any better. then what I discovered, it wasn't really a hygienic suggestion, it was really more of a software architecture suggestion. So there's this guy in industry, guy with a pocket protector and a slide rule, kind of came up with these rules of, here is a much better way for us to create connected systems. And so that's what started REST. Now, with SOAP, what was funny is that its acronym status got revoked because it wasn't simple. But look at REST. That started off the bat with acronym issues. Kind of it's an acronym violation using RE. Okay, I digress. But the idea is it's much simpler than SOAP, and it's just based on these HTTP request-response pairs. Let's keep it really simple. And so what we're going to do is we're going to have the client just send requests and get responses over HTTP and HTTPS. Now, there's this idea of resources. So I'm a client, and I'm going to be calling over to that thing on the other side. There's some type of a resource. It's a customer. So we're never going to move the customer across the wire. We create a representation of it. And the idea of a representation is I use text, HTML, XML, JavaScript, object notation, and that's what allows me to create the things that are actually going to pass back and forth across the network. Okay, now, the resources aren't moved, but they're basically modeled by representations. Now, when we create what we call as a RESTful web service, it's just basically a web service that's implemented with HTTP and/or HTTPS according to the principles of REST. So the first thing we have to understand is what is the URL, or what we call the URI. So there's going to be this base URI to where basically the REST service lives, and then there's going to be some type of a resource path that might basically represent a customer, or it might represent a SharePoint site, or a SharePoint list, or a SharePoint item. And then there's going to be query options. So what REST is really big on is using query strings to basically pass things like the where clause and the order by clause. Another thing is going to stick with the standard verbs that are just part of the HTTP specification. Let's not create our own new verbs and have all these issues, with firewalls just say, I don't understand the verb, I'm not letting you through. Now, the data is going to be passed back and forth via representations. And then when you create a REST service, well, you kind of create an API, because you basically have a base URI, and then you're going to have all these different resources and all these different options. And so what we'll see is I could create a custom API, which is going to be the first demo that I show you. But I could also take one of the standard REST APIs, that's what OData is, and implement that as well. Okay, now before we move on, let's talk a little bit more about representations. So what are they? They're the things that we package up so we can move back and forth across the network in a request body or a response body of the HTTP request-response pair. Now, they're really not the same thing as the resource. They're conceptually separate, and common uses of representations use text, XML. They use a special form of XML called Atom that we'll take a little bit of a look at, and also JavaScript object notation, or JSON. Now, these things are identified by the party you're sending it to using these things called internet media types. So these things started off as MIME types, but as soon as they added support for audio, they realized that MIME wasn't a good use. Okay, another bad joke, I apologize. But they define basically what's inside the body of the message. So we have things like text HTML, text XML, and then some of them are preceded by application to say they're specific to a certain type of application. So we have application/XML, application/Atom /x.x plus XML, and then JSON. Now, when this comes, into our, perceived focus as a developer, quite often is when I'm getting ready to send a request to the REST service, I might have to set the content type. For instance, I package up some customer data, and I'm basically sending an HTTP request that's going to add a customer. And I can use XML, or I can use Atom plus XML, or I can use JSON. But I have to set the header, which is the content type header in the request. So when it hits the REST service can look at the content type and say, hey, I know what to expect inside there. Okay, another important header is the accept header. the client sends the accept header saying, when you send something back to me, here's what I want. And if you say something like accept, star, you're basically saying, pass me anything you want. But we can also be very specific in our accept headers and basically say, just pass me XML or Atom XML or JSON. Okay, now, next thing we're going to look at is the two common internet media types that we deal with in SharePoint. So we have Atom plus XML, which is short for atomic publishing, which is basically an XML vocabulary that got popular back when RSS feeds became popular. It's actually two specifications, merged together, one for RSS, feeds, and the other one for posting, basically with a write-back capability. And the accept is going to be application/Atom plus XML. And then the other thing that has gotten to be very popular lately, arguably more popular than Atom plus XML, is JavaScript object notation. And so the idea is that we can basically take JavaScript code that defines an object, and that object could have child objects that have grandchild objects, so we can nest things, as deep as we'd like, and we pass it across the network as a string. But over on the other side, this is highly beneficial when there's programming in JavaScript, because it can take that string and rehydrate it as JavaScript objects, and then it gets to be easy just to say object.property1, object.property2. Now, sometimes you're using C#, and you might still, use JavaScript object notation by choice, or the fact that the web service you're dealing with gives you no other option than to use JSON. So really, JavaScript object notation is highly desirable to use in JavaScript, and it's okay to use in C#, and sometimes you have to. Okay, now, here are the tools that I want everyone to embrace if you haven't already embraced them. Well, obviously, Visual Studio, and I'm going to be showing some examples in both client-side JavaScript code and server-side C# code in this session. If you haven't embraced jQuery, the time is ripe. You're going to see if you create a new SharePoint hosted app, they automatically add the JavaScript core library source file, and they add links to it inside there. That's Microsoft's subtle hint of, if you don't know jQuery, you better learn it soon. And also Fiddler. Okay, just curious. How many people here use Fiddler on a regular basis? Okay, look at that. Good stuff. Okay, so let's go ahead and move over to my first demo. Okay, so over here on my demo machine, we'll go ahead and open that up. And oh, this opened up, what's this company? Critical Path Training. I think these guys are here at the conference. I think they have an exhibitor booth. I think there's salespeople standing by where you actually could walk up and register for a class. Okay, I digress. One thing I want to point out is that if you go to the members section of the site and you go to the presentation download, so 2 clicks, what you're going to see is that the code and slides for this session and my 2 other sessions today are here. So you can basically download that. We make you give us an email address, but if you want to use any of the code. Okay, so let's get on with the demo that I want to show you. So I have a very simple application here. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start up Visual Studio. And I'm going to say run as administrator, which seems to be even more important in this version than it was in the last version. And then I'm going to go ahead and open up this particular project that I have, which is going to be the simple REST service. Now, I have code on the client side. That's the thing I really want to concentrate on. I have some very simple REST service code, but this session is not about building REST services. We might step through it just to kind of give you the consumer perception of what's happening inside the REST service, but it's really the client side that I want to focus on. Okay, so let's take a quick look at this app right here. And as I look at this particular app, I wanted to kind of keep things fairly simple as far as the UI goes. So I just have a couple command buttons, and I have a result. And then I have a JavaScript file. So here's some jQuery code, basically using the document ready event handler to hook up event handlers on some things right here. Now I'm going to be using the jQuery AJAX method. And note that if you haven't used it before, it caches by default. And if you're trying to do demo work and you click it and you change your code and you go back and click it, nothing's working, because you got to basically turn the caching off, if you're changing things on the fly. Okay, well, let's go back here. And before I start this up, let's go ahead and take our little friend Fiddler. And we'll just kind of do hello world here by going back, taking Fiddler, and removing everything that's inside there. And this first request right here, pretty simple request. And so when I start using this, you can see things like the raw request and the raw response. If it's encoded or compressed, you might have to come down and put something inside there. So one thing that you can see with this code right here is that jQuery allows you to reference something like a div on the page. And then one of the simplicity methods that calls the equivalent of the AJAX method behind the scenes is load. But load doesn't really give you control over the accept header. But you can see here that when we use this, if we go back and we take a look at the accept header right there, you're going to see that the accept came through and basically said, give me text HTML or anything else. Okay, now if I go and I want to call things explicitly, here I want to get some HTML back. And so what we're going to do in this case is now we're going to call into this web service. So what I wanted to do is just create things that are real simple. So I created a getCustomers list.ashx. And if I go take a look at that right here, you can see that when someone implements the web service that you're going to be consuming, they typically do things like they look at the accept types. Note that you can pass multiple accept types. And this web service sees if you've asked for text HTML, it's just going to create an HTML document and send it back to you. Okay, well, let's say we want to do something different. Let's say that now what we'd like to do is we'd like to get something back as XML. So here, you have to use the AJAX method. There's things like getJSON, load. What you find is those other things are convenient things that just don't give you the control that you need for SharePoint. So in this case right here, you create this JavaScript object. You pass the URL. What's the verb? It's a get. Here's the accept parameter inside there. And remember, here is the content type. Now, in this case, it doesn't matter because I'm not sending anything in the request body to the server. So I could actually left that one out. Data type is basically a hint to jQuery to say when the body of the request or the response comes back, how should it process it? So in this case, I call this, there's a callback method that gets called here. And what you're going to see is fairly straight ahead. I go ahead and call back to that. Now, let me show you another tool. It's going to be really important to you. Okay, if I hit F12, and here I am inside this tool set that I'm sure many of you use, which is the IE developer toolset. Okay, now I could do the demos with the other ones, the one that's built into Chrome. I could do it with Firebug as well. I'm sure if I was at a conference that Google was sponsoring and I used something other than Chrome, they wouldn't ask me back. Microsoft's much cooler than that, but I'll still use the IE developer toolbar. Okay, so what we're going to do here is we're going to go over to script. We're now going to go down here, and we're going to basically pick this default.js file. And now let's go ahead and set a breakpoint down here, and I'll click on Start Debugging. Now that I've done that, let's go back here, click on Get XML. Now what we can do is we can start single-stepping through the code. And as you move through these, you can come back over here to the watch window and do various things inside. Okay. And then the other thing is, once we've sent that back and forth, you being able to come through here when things go wrong. Fiddler is your debugging tool. Why didn't it work? It gave me an error message saying something went wrong and I need more information. So coming back here, making sure that your accept was correct. And now we'll go back and we'll look at the response and look at the headers. Inside the response, what's the content type length? What came back inside there? Do I want to look at just the raw data that came back? And also, they have little tabs here. So when you have things like XML or JSON, they give you a friendly view inside there. Okay, now as we keep moving on here, let's go ahead and look at this next option, where we're going to work in terms of JSON. Now, in this case right here, let me just take a quick look at this code that basically says if you have requested as a client that I pass you a JavaScript object notation response, while I don't really want to go into too much detail about things over on the server side, look how easy .NET makes it. I create these objects right here. I then create a customer list object, add customer objects, and I pull out this thing called the JavaScript serializer, and I can just basically send that back. Now, over on the client side, let's go back down here, and here you can see that as I set this one up, I'm asking for JavaScript object notation. Okay. Now, if we look at this code down here, this code basically receives a JavaScript object, not text, nothing we have to do work on. And so this really kind of points out the value of the data type parameter. The data type parameter doesn't affect what goes over the network. It just tells JavaScript when it comes back, it's going to be JSON. So jQuery does the work instead of me of taking the string and converting it into a JavaScript object. Okay, so now over here, we'll go ahead, run this right here, and what we can see is that as this request went back and forth across the network, we asked for JSON. When we look at the response, it basically passed back a JavaScript object, and if I click on JSON right here, I can go down and basically see those things that are inside there. Okay. Now, next thing we're going to look at is the code over here. And so once I've got this code, and there's my customer list inside, this thing is something we're going to have to do now. Let's go back here. We still have this debugger running. Let's go back in our debugger and go down to the code that's going to deal with the response coming back. Okay, so I come back here. I run this one more time. Boom, I fall inside here. Let's go back over to the locals window. Let's look at this JavaScript object and being able to get the debugging information inside here gets to be essential, especially when you're so used to C# and strongly typed assemblies that just hand feed you with IntelliSense everything you need to know, and then you go over to JavaScript and it's like go fish. And this becomes your best way to kind of see that JavaScript object. What are the properties? What are the methods? How do I get to them? And I find this to be an indispensable tool to be able to get the kind of information back. Okay, now the next thing we're going to look at is query options. So here I have this set of different customers inside. And once again, we're going to kind of peek into the world of the REST service implementer. So in this case right here, we have someone who's implementing this. And so what they're going to do is they're going to look at the request, and here's the ASP.NET way to basically find the query string parameters. And we're going to look for something which is living. So in this case right here, if I come back here and we put in a query string parameter, living equals 1, basically we've asked just for those items that meet a particular characteristic. If I come back here and I put living equals 0, we're going to pull the other one back. So I've just showed you a very simple example of a single query string parameter. But when people create custom APIs, they don't want just one parameter. They want a second and a third and a fourth and a fifth possibly. But you setting these query string parameters gets to be a very important aspect. Okay, the very last thing I want to look at in this initial demo is let's create an object over on the client. Let's say the scenario is I want to create a new customer object. So what we need to do is we need to package it up as a JSON type. Not sure what's going on over there. Okay, we have a medical issue. We're just going to wait until we can somehow resolve this issue over there. go ahead and resume. My apologies for too much of this new content at once. You can see what kind of impact it has. Okay. So the last thing that we want to show here is basically, moving JSON data from the client, over to the server. So let's go back and take a look at the client side. Now I could have created a form for the user to input data. So I kind of made things simple just by hard coding in some information here. There's my customer. And built into the browsers is a JSON object, and we can call stringify to take our JavaScript object and turn it into a string based on JavaScript object notation. Now this time, when I set up the call to the AJAX function, there's the URL. This is going to be a post. This is going to be JSON, and you can see that I use the data parameter to pass that inside there. Now, you have to specify the content type in this case because the request has content, and the server has to know what type of content you're passing across. And so in our case right here, let's go ahead and take everything and remove all the stuff inside here. And then we'll come back here and we'll have a post. And what we can see is that back here in Fiddler, if we look at the raw data going across the network, it's just simple. And then what's the response that comes back? In this case, we've just kind of passed back the customer, maybe over on the server. We generate a primary key that the client needs, so we pass that back on the other side. Okay, so that first demo was just to kind of cover all the different things that we have to know before we even get to SharePoint, which adds tons of extra complications, into the story. So we've covered just some of the basics of REST. Now we're going to move on to OData. Now, with OData, we have this new API. Some of you as old as me, DAO, RDO, ADO, ADO.NET. This is just the next thing in the chain, except now it's not stylish for you to use an in-process DLL. Instead, we want an API of a REST service across the internet. So OData, is the new data access API for when we're using HTTP-based clients. Now, OData is going to standardize the things you would expect in a data API. A way to get back a customer list, and to add a where clause and an order by clause. Now, it's based on this specification, which you can basically look at www.odata.org. I've got a lot of information from the spec inside my slides, so I'm not going to go there in this demo, but I really encourage you to go to that site because it's got just great information in it. Okay, now when we start using OData, there's a couple concepts. So we're going to be moving representations back and forth across the network, and I can either use Atom or JavaScript object notation. Both are supported. And what are we going to move back? So the representations we have are things like collections of entries. And we have an entry, which is something that maps to a record in a database or an item in a SharePoint list. Now, when we start getting our hands around OData, we've actually covered 50% of it. Just understanding REST and how to do gets versus posts, how to take data and put it into JSON or Atom and then send it across in requests, and understand how to deal with it when it comes back in responses. That's half the game. So read operations are going to map to gets. Insert operations are going to match to the HTTP post. Update operations map to put, but put's kind of funky. Let's say you have a list item that's got 20 columns, and you want to update 3 of them. If you use put, all 17 other columns go back to their default value. So we have one called patch. Patch basically says, here are the 3 columns I want to change, leave everything else alone. Note that SharePoint 2010 also has some REST support, nowhere near as extensive as 2013. And that didn't use the patch verb, it used merge. So if you've used SharePoint 2010, stop using merge and use patch. They both have the same functionality, it's just patch is a more standardized and part of the newest OData spec. And then there's an HTTP delete for delete operations. Okay, now, When it's time for us to create the URIs that we're going to use, basically we're just going to create them according to the rules of REST. There is some service root URI, and in many cases it's going to have an SVC extension, and then there's some type of a resource path. And so the resource paths have to be created by the REST service according to a standard set of rules, but the way that resource paths work in SharePoint is different than they work in other things. So you have to learn a lot of SharePoint-specific things, to get at the resource paths. And then there's query options, which once again, the SharePoint team created according to the rules of REST, but they're very specific to SharePoint. Okay. Now, when we start doing things and making OData calls into SharePoint, maybe I want to start getting data back. So here are our parameters. Note that all of them start with $signs. So there's the $select. That allows me to pick which columns I want. I want to query a list with 10 columns, but I only want 3 columns back. So I say, question mark, here comes my query string, $select equals column 1, comma, column 2, comma, column 3. Filter is what allows me to add the where clause inside there. In this example, we have $filter equals, starts with column 1, comma, value I want to search on. There is an order by. Note that we have top and skip. Top says, give me the first 10. Skip says, skip those and give me the ones after it. Now, if you look at that second line after skip 5, and then give me the top 5, that gives us a basis for paging. Give me the first 10, then the next 10, then the next 10, just by incrementing the skip number. And then when we get into some more advanced topics, there's also an expand, where I could basically specify 2 different collections that have a association or relationship between them. Give me categories, but then expand into products. Okay, now, here's just a little bit more drill down. Here's all the stuff that you can go and find on www.odata.org. I just copied this stuff into Excel and made it pretty. But note that when you use the filter, there's lots of OData, not SharePoint-specific stuff that you're going to follow. So here's the things where the SharePoint team kind of had to follow the rules of implementing the behavior, behind these different functions inside there. Okay. So what we have here is we have, using the filter parameter, we have lots of string functions inside there, substring of, ends with, starts with, length, index of, replace substring, and then just a couple other miscellaneous functions, for dates, for doing math, and for looking at types. As the data lives, inside that REST service, every single collection is going to have some type of a type name. So I can also go and do queries, based on the type name inside there. Okay, so now that we've seen some of just the generic principles of OData, let's apply them to SharePoint 2013. So back in SharePoint 2010, we got the client object model, client SVC, and we never programmed directly against client SVC. Instead, we use a DLL, or we'd use a JavaScript library that Microsoft gave me, and I'd basically program against those things, and behind the scenes, that code would issue the required calls to client.svc. For many different reasons, Microsoft decided that just having the CSOM alone without REST support was a deficiency. One issue is that the client-side object model is much easier to program inside of C# than JavaScript. REST APIs are just easier to use in many, many scenarios. Not all, but many. The other issue that Microsoft had is if you have the client-side object model and you're writing server-side code, you got to use .NET. If we give you REST support, hey, go run on any OS you want, use any web service platform or any client technology you want. If you can submit HTTP GET and put and post requests, you can play. So basically taking the CSOM coverage and then basically wrapping it with the exact same coverage inside of REST, got to be a huge thing. And the other thing that's really nice about the REST APIs and CSOM is it's not limited to only SharePoint Foundation functionality, but now both CSOM and REST extend into search and user profiles and BCS and tons of other places that our code had to be on the box for, in 2010 to be able to get at. Now, when we program against REST, the ultimate endpoint is going to be client.sbc. So a big change is now we program directly against _VTI_bin/client.sbc. However, Microsoft allows you just to say /_API, and that can be used instead of the direct call to client.sbc, and you should use that because Microsoft's saying use that, and in the next version, we're not sure if _VTI_bin/client.sbc is going to change or not. So we're basically going to use the underscore inside there. Okay, so now if we look at this top URL, HTTP wingtip server / I could use _VTI_bin/client.sbc. So that becomes my base URL. And then what comes afterwards is going to be an object mapping that SharePoint supports. But what we want to do is we want to use the _API/web. Now, here's some examples of what we can get inside there. API/web. Give me information about the current site. API/web/list. Give me information about the lists. So learning all the different ways that SharePoint does the object mapping, is what's going to be important to you. Okay, now we can get some testing by doing things through the browser. Microsoft did some changes between Beta 2 and RTM that makes this demo a little grungier than it was in Beta 2. In particular, when you execute calls to the browser, the default experience often doesn't show. And I'm going to show you a little kind of trick to be able to get there. Okay, so let's go ahead and get to this next demo right here. And so inside of this demo, let's leave Fiddler up and alive for a second. And let's go over to my site. I'm going to go over to my site, and I'm going to say _API/web. Now, I've actually made a couple changes, inside of my browser to make this work. Some of the things that, if you just want to see the raw XML inside there, if I go to the Internet Explorer, and then I go to Content, and I go to Feeds and Slices, this is turned on by default. So you need to turn this off, or it will give you kind of that pretty view, and it won't show you the raw XML. But once you kind of get into this XML view right here, okay, well, what else do I want to see? How about /lists? Okay, so now I say /lists, and now it comes back, shows me the different things. Look at all the things that we have on lists. I don't want to see all those different columns inside there. So now we'll add our query string. We'll say $select equals, and maybe I just want to see the title column. And then it comes back and it just shows me the title column inside there. And so by using this approach right here, you can basically just use the browser and all the types of queries that need specific wheres and order bys. You can basically just do your testing through there, just to kind of get up to speed before you start writing code where it's going to be harder to kind of test things inside. Okay. So now we're going to look at OData programming. And there's lots of good stuff that we're going to show here. So let's start by asking the question, are we going to use C# or are we going to use JavaScript? And question might be, well, are you creating a SharePoint hosted app where your code has to be running inside of the client? Well, then you have to use JavaScript. Well, I guess you could kind of use Silverlight and C#, but for the most part, client-side code is all going to be JavaScript. But what are you going to do over on the server? If we have a provider-hosted app or we have an auto-hosted app, I've got an ASP.NET website running my code inside the server, and so then my choice is C# or VB.NET. And so then when I talk to SharePoint, I could use either CSOM or I could use the REST API. I'm not going to show anything here with CSOM. I'm going to show some C# code against the REST API. But just note that when you are working with C#, you have a much higher motivation to look at CSOM and see if that's a better alternative, because it might be more productive. Okay, So some of the things that we can do is, if we're going to use C#, we're going to be putting together these URLs, _API/web/list, get by title customers, select equals title. Now, if you were writing this kind of code pre.NET 4, we didn't have this thing called the HTTP web request, so you probably use just web request. So if you haven't used HTTP web request in C# or VB.NET, it's time to start using it. It just adds a couple benefits over just the standard web request object. So I can set my credentials in the case where I just want to use user authentication to call in. That would not be what you do in an app that uses app authentication. But now we can set our accept header inside there, and then I call get response. I get the response stream back, and the other little tidbit here is quite often you're dealing with these big XML documents, and if you're still kind of doing old school XML programming with XML Reader and some of the older XML APIs, you really have to look at the system.xml.link stuff with XDocument, which just makes things so much easier. For instance, once I take the response stream and I load it into one of these XDocument objects, I can create one of these XDocument namespaces, and then I can basically just say doc.descendants, and look how easy it is to pull a value that might be 3 or 4 levels down inside the XML document out. So that's just a huge productivity tip if you're not already familiar with that. Now, when it comes to JavaScript code, once again, I would highly recommend jQuery. Not that it's required. You could use the web request that's built into ASP.NET Ajax. There's ways just to do it in raw JavaScript. But since Microsoft is kind of going in the direction of jQuery, I'd say once you go there, you'll never come back. You'll be very happy with the facilities to call across the network and the control you have using jQuery. Now, another thing that I want to point out in this demo right here is this guy right here, which is the _SP page context info. Okay, that's actually a JavaScript variable that's been around before 2013, before 2010. That was there in 2007, before many of us were doing any type of JavaScript programming. But the idea is that the web part manager automatically throws this JavaScript object onto every single page so that JavaScript code can quickly get things like the ability to figure out what is the root of the current site or the current site collection. And that's quite often why we use it in REST-based programming. So here, we basically find the root of the current site and then say _API, web, list, put things together, and then we simply submit the Ajax request. Another big change that Microsoft made between Beta 2 and RTM is back before RTM, you could always get away with saying application/JSON, but as of RTM, both when you're sending and you're setting the accept parameter, you have to put the OData equals verbose on the end or it will not work, which basically means all of our code kind of broke and we had to go and patch that up to make it work with RTM. Okay. Note that there is in the OData specification an OData equals light, kind of a light API, but it's not supported by this version of SharePoint. So that's why we have to say OData equals verbose. Okay. Now, next thing we have to worry about is this thing which is the form digest. Now, the form digest is something that's been around a long time in SharePoint too. The form digest is a value that SharePoint puts on the page when it sends it back to the user. And the main motivation for Microsoft adding the form digest is to prevent replay attacks. Say that you just basically submitted a request to add a new customer. And I'm the evil guy on the network, and I see that packet coming across, and I look at that, and so maybe what I want to do is just change a couple things in the body, and then basically submit another post, right to the same place. So the form digest is a value that is created on the SharePoint server. And it takes all kinds of information, about the client, about the time, and it basically sends back this little value that's made, with cryptographic functions, And the idea is whenever there's a post that comes back that intends to update data, SharePoint looks at the form digest and validates that it's authentic to basically make sure that no one's trying to do any funny business. But the big important thing for you to grasp as a developer is that if you don't explicitly pass the form digest back, nothing's going to ever get updated. Okay, now, it turns out that when you're writing client-side JavaScript, it's really easy because they add a control to the page that's well known as far as this name goes. So you just have to know what the control name is, and I'll show you an example in a second. However, what if you're doing C# programming? You're doing C# programming against the network, and you don't have a page that has the form digest. So that's when you have to make an explicit call into SharePoint saying, I want to do an update. I need a form digest value so I can submit it when I push things back. Okay. Now, let's say I want to add an item. So here's some simple code in JavaScript. And the first thing you have to do is you have to basically set your URI to basically a resource that maps to the list that you care about, which in this case is web/list, get by title, customers/items. Note that there's no query strings when you're adding. There's query strings when you're pulling data back. Next, I have to deal with the request headers. So I set my accept header. And then second, I have to include a special header, which is x-request digest. And if I look over here at, what is this thing right here? So there is a control that the standard master pages add, which is _ request digest. And the pound sign on the front of that is just the jQuery way to basically grab a HTML element by its ID. And then I basically just call a value on that and set it to the xdigest property inside there. Another thing that will be very new to many of you is when you want to add items, you have to know the type of that target list. And the type isn't contact list versus announcements list. If I create two different contacts lists, each one will have a different type. Now, in some cases, you can kind of create the list. For instance, if you create a list named customers, it will create a data type for that list named customers list item. But now when you create a second and a third, quite often they'll have numbers inside. So you might have to query the list to get back the metadata type of the list before you can add items to it. Okay, well now I create the customer data inside here. I go ahead and stringify it, and then I basically just post it back, using the exact same techniques that we talked about, in the first demo. Okay, how about if I want to delete an item? Deleting an item is pretty simple. You have a URI that points to that particular list, and then you have to figure out, what is the ID. So remember in SharePoint, when you create a list and you start adding items, they just get IDs, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that's all that is. It's just basically the integer ID that SharePoint automatically tracks each list item and each document with. Okay, once again, I have to set up things like the accept header. I have to set up the digest. Actually, I take it back. I took it back, then I give it back. You have to have the accept header because it does push some data back to you to say it deleted the item. But now we have this thing right here, if match. Now, SharePoint implements an optimistic concurrency scheme. And the reason we have this, and it's really the OData spec that defines this, and Microsoft had to implement it in SharePoint. The idea is if I pull back an item and I start to modify it, and in between the time I read it and I try to update it, you pull back the item and you update it out from under me. If SharePoint allows me to blindly overwrite that, we're going to have a lost update. So SharePoint creates these things called e-tags. And the idea of the e-tag is it's the version number. And in the demo I'm going to show you, I'll show you how you could set e-tags. But if you just want to say, like the LAPD, shoot first, ask questions later, you can basically just put the star inside there saying turn off optimistic concurrency, and basically just override it regardless. So with delete, that's a pretty safe bet. It's the update that things get to be more difficult. Now, when we look at the update here, well, here inside the update, a couple things to point out. I'll show you this code inside the demo, the kind of code behind this. But in this case right here, you can see that we already have the E tag. So generally, if you show a grid that's sitting on the page for 5 minutes and someone says update, generally, the first thing you want to do is go back right then before you bring up the update form and get the latest version just in case the E tag has changed. But the idea is, once you have all the data and the E tag, well, now we can go ahead, put together the request headers. So there's accept, there's the digest, and now here's the case right here where SharePoint and IIS aren't really hip with the merge HTTP verb. Sometimes firewalls aren't either. So what we should do is when we put it inside there, we're just going to use a standard post. However, we're going to tell SharePoint we're using the merge HTTP verb. At least that's how you should interpret it. And the idea is if I have a bunch of columns that I'm not updating, don't set those back to the default value. Leave them the way they are. And then there's the E tag. And if I don't want to deal with E tags for some reason, I could just put star here as well. OK. So I think we need to see a little bit more code here now. So let me go ahead and move over to this other machine. I'll move over to this other machine. Let's go back here. And let's go ahead and start with the C# project. OK, now, this will be a subtle motivation for you maybe to, after you see REST, look into see CSOM. Maybe it's easier. But what I have here is just some code that's going to do things like add a list and add a couple items to each of the lists. Now, when it's time for me to do updates, I have to get that form digest value. So here's a case right here where you can just go to the base URI and get the context info information back. And when you get the context info information back, it's got the form digest as one of the values that you could take. And that form digest lasts for 30 minutes by default. So typically, you're going to have enough time to change that. OK, now let's go ahead and look at the code to create a list. So the base URI is the collection of lists in the target site. Once again, I'm just using plain user authentication instead of app authentication in this demo. But I have to set the content type because I'm going to pass data across the network. There's the accept header. There's the X request digest header. There is the post inside there. And then we're going to basically take things like title. Now, there are many different ways you could do it. You could parse this stuff together. But just to make it a little bit easier for you to visualize, what I've done is I've created these little templates. I've created templates because basically this is what you need to send in, and we're just going to swap out this one particular value. So what this code is doing is basically taking that template, swapping out the title, and then we're going to go ahead and submit it. And what type of a form are we creating? 105 contacts list. OK, now once we've created the contacts lists, what we're going to get back is this one particular document that gives us information about the type of list. So let's go ahead and move all this inside here. Let's go back here, and I am going to get this information right here. Let's go ahead and run this code. As I run this code through here, you're going to see that let's see, did it stop or did it just keep going? Okay, if I go back here, what you're going to see is that the first thing we wanted to get back was basically the authorization. And so if I take a look at the XML inside there, or, OK, I'm sorry, I'm fumbling around a little bit. Let me make this code a little bit smaller. let me go ahead and run this one more time. So what I'm trying to show here, desperately, is that when it's time for me to create the item, basically we've done a post. We've done the particular post, and I basically fill the information inside there. And what gets sent back to me is going to be important in this demo. Let's go back here, and what we can see is that there is some XML, and the XML is going to include the data type that I have to care about, which in our case right here is going to be data customer XO0. So basically, for me to be able to now add items, you can see what this code does is it basically grabs those values and passes it like a baton, back to this next method, create customer item. And when we call create customer item inside here, if I go back here to items, and we can see that as I pass this thing inside right here, I've passed this one particular value inside. So that kind of shows you two important things that I think are really tricky. One is getting the form digest, and the second one is you create a list, you want to add an item, you've got to get that value back from the list before you can add an item. And if you don't have that particular type value of the list item, it's going to fail as you try to add those things inside. Then we come back over here just to make sure that everything worked. Basically, you can see that I've created the list, added the items inside there with C#, which could be just in a client-side smart application, across the network, or it could be inside of a SharePoint app. And if it's inside of a SharePoint app, you're going to have to then come to the next two sessions. I'm going to go because I'm going to go into more about how we get authentication working inside there. Okay, one more thing that I want to demo, and that is going to be a REST app which is done in JavaScript. Now, for this application right here, the first thing I want you to see is that I create a list. So the SharePoint hosted app gets created. It creates a list inside the app web. So I have some code to basically query against. So let's go ahead and just run the app. I'll go ahead and hit F5 right here. And the first thing that we want to take a look at is this code that's inside. So this comes up, gives me this user interface here. One of the things that really bugs a lot of people is they go to this new app world. Oh, great, yeah, this sounds fun. Okay, so you create an app. Okay, so where's the UI? Oh, there's no UI in an app. You've got to build that from scratch. So here's just an example of there's a list inside there, but generally we don't want to use the UI that's built into SharePoint for people to use to see what's inside of our app web. So here's just a case of building the things inside there. So in this case right here, I'm going to basically put some code and event handler behind this one button, and then I'm going to call get customers. I call get customers, and get customers basically puts together the URI. It then calls Ajax and sends a get, puts the stuff inside there, and then as the data comes back, there's this one div. I empty it out, and so here's an example of getting the data back inside there. Now, one more time, let me go back here and hit the F12 key. And I hit the F12 key, I go to script, and I go to app.js. And when this comes back, I want to go ahead and debug it, and I click on start debugging, and boom, it doesn't work. Okay, so here's the tip that will make this session pay for itself. It'll pay for the whole SharePoint conference. If you hit the F5 key, it attaches the Visual Studio JavaScript debugger to the browser, which means you can't use any of the debuggers built into browsers. Instead, if you do Control F5, you basically start without debugging. So let me go ahead and kill this, and now I'll hold down the Control, hit the F5 key. If you like the Visual Studio JavaScript debugger, God bless you, it's great. I just find it's a little bit more complicated. I I think the guys, after they got kicked off the soap team, came over and created just kidding. Okay. So let's go ahead and run this thing right here. We'll come back here. We'll look at my output window. I've hit Control F5. I thought I'd hit Control F5. One more time, Control F5. Okay, it's starting to come up. So what I just want to do is set a couple breakpoints, so we can step through various aspects of this code. So let's go back here. Let's go back to script. Let's now go back to app.js. So one thing I want to do is step through, what's going to happen when it's time to get the result that comes back from the AJAX call, and I want to populate that particular grid. Maybe some of the other things we'd like to do is, what's going to happen when I want to add a customer. So I'm going to set a couple more breakpoints here along the way. And now that I have those set there, I think there's just one more I need to put down here on update customer. Okay, so now we'll go ahead and say start debugging. And now we'll go back and let's basically just refresh the page. So I go ahead and refresh the page, and now I can kind of fall down inside here. And so as I get this back and I look at this data that gets returned back to me, once again, let's go ahead and look at this data. It was a string, and AJAX automatically converted to a string to a JavaScript object. And if I go back and I take a look at that, by looking at this particular view inside here, you can get so much information. So that's one thing that I really encourage you just to get up to speed with. The second thing is I got a bunch of JavaScript. I got to create HTML. So how do I do that? And so in this case, I'm using this library called JS Render. But there's other great libraries out there. Knockout.js, comes to mind as something that's gaining a lot of popularity. So look to these other JavaScript libraries. In this case right here, if I use JS Render, it allows me to kind of create templates with HTML. And once I create the particular templates with HTML, I can then just use a very simple syntax of create the template and then go ahead and add that, build the table from it. Okay. Well, let's say there's this guy on my team, Parasailing, just never really got along with that guy. We wanted to go ahead and delete that. So in this case right here, what we need to do is we need to know that particular ID. So typically behind the scenes or in view, you're putting that inside there. And now we're stepping through here and basically just executing the delete method right here. Okay, and then the last one I want to show you is the update, because that's a little bit more complicated. Well, the first thing is someone's going to click on this button. Someone clicks on this button right here, and so what I'd like to do is I'd like to bring up a dialog. Now, you can use the jQuery dialog. You can use the dialog that's built in SharePoint. Either one will work fine. So I'll go ahead and hit F5 right here, and that's going to bring that up. So we'll go ahead and add something else inside there. Now, once we click on Save, now we're just going to basically scrape the dialog inside there and basically put the things together like you saw inside the slides. You can see that __ request digest. That's just that control that's on every single SharePoint page. And just like you saw in the slides, we'll go ahead and push the value inside. And then finally, update. Update's the tricky one because when you click on update, the E tag might have changed last minute. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to call back into SharePoint and get the updated version of that one particular item. And in this case right here, I'm going to get that back. And as I get that back, and now we're going to go ahead and make a change here. Click Save. So now here is when you see the D results come back in. And in the D results that I have here, what you're going to see is that inside here, you're able to bring back the E tag inside. And you're able to basically pull that out. which is going to make it so that when it's time for you to submit the request, like we're finally going to do, we're able to push that E tag back in. Okay, so that takes us to the conclusion of that particular demo. Let me go ahead and now move on to the last section. Okay, so I think we have about 8 more minutes. And as I mentioned, because I have 2 more sessions that drill down on this last topic, I'm just going to kind of cover this at a high level. So we have OData. Now we have OAuth. So let's kind of start by talking about, before we had apps back in SharePoint 2010, we only had SharePoint solutions. What were the big problems that they gave us? So there's big problems related to security. And that is, you're a developer, I'm the administrator. If I let you take your farm solution and run it inside of my farm, I basically just have to trust that you're a good guy, you know how to code, and you don't intend to hurt me or my farm. So by default, code runs with the permissions of the current user. However, developers can call that run with elevated privileges. Is there anyone here who has never called that? You're all sinister, I know that. So as far as SharePoint's concerned, code runs a SharePoint/system and can do anything it wants. So I'm the administrator. I have to trust you. And someone says, Mr. Administrator, we'll give you 2 choices. A enforcement policy so Ted can't hurt you, or trust Ted and hope he doesn't hurt you. Which one do you like better? So obviously, that was the Pandora's box of SharePoint that they wanted to cure with apps. Sandbox solutions are equally as problematic. Everyone thinks that sandbox solutions protect everything. They protect the farm, they protect the other site collections, but sandbox solutions don't collect the site collection in which they're activated, because the code always runs as the current user. To activate a sandbox solution, who do you have to be? You have to be basically the site administrator. So the code always runs as site administrator, and you're just trusting the code not to delete every list and document library in the site collection. So the basic problem that we have is that SharePoint solution code can't be authenticated, doesn't have its own identity, therefore we can't configure permissions for it that are separate and distinct from user permissions. Now, in SharePoint 2013, we got this new app model. And one of the big, shiny aspects of this is the fact that now when developers write code and that code calls into SharePoint, SharePoint has a way to authenticate the code and basically look at the app as a distinct security principle apart from the current user. And now what we have is the default policy is that both the app needs permission and the user needs permission to be able to accomplish something. So if the app doesn't have permissions, the app can't do anything. So having the authentication mechanism built in just puts the people who care about security and the safety of a farm in a much better place. Now, as far as what are the requirements for establishing app identity? Well, we have to be in a web application that's claims aware. So Microsoft's also making a big push to start using claims if you're still using classic mode. So SharePoint apps just aren't supported in those. The other important thing to see is that app authentication is only supported in CSOM and REST endpoints. So when you call in using REST or CSOM, the app can be authenticated. If the app tries to make any other call, there's no pipeline to authenticate the app in those particular cases. Okay, so apps get permissions. They have identities. And what we're going to see is that if you're writing an app, your app has this default set of permissions to be able to access and have full control over its own special little site called the app web. And then you have some very limited read permissions on the host site where it got installed. But if you want to do more, like you want to create a document library in the host web, you've got to request permissions, and then some user who has that permission has to grant those permissions to the app. Now, there's various places where app permissions get stored. Sometimes they're stored in the content database. Sometimes they're stored in the configuration database. But don't take anything that you know about user permissions and think it works the same with app permissions. User permissions work in terms of securable objects that have a hierarchy. You got the top-level site and a child site and a list and an item, and you have this permission hierarchy. Nothing like that when it comes to app permissions. App permissions are scoped to the site collection, or the tenancy. and then it's just something like read or write or manage. Okay. So, if you come to my next session, I'm going to step through this after explaining it. I don't have time here. But what I'm hoping at the end of next session is that I'll get everyone to make their O face at the end of this, or at least their OAuth face, whatever you want to make there. Okay, but the idea is that the user calls into SharePoint. This is, I apologize, that might have been a little racy. Okay, but basically you call into SharePoint, and SharePoint creates a user claim. Now, what then is going to happen is that SharePoint is going to call into Windows Azure Access Control Services, ACS, and ACS is going to pass back something called a context token. The context token then gets put in some JavaScript component on the page called an app launcher. When the user launches the app, the context token basically gets pushed to your remote web in basically an HTTP variable. So what then happens is the client app can take the context token and use information inside there to go back to ACS and get an access token. Once you get the access token, you're then going to be able to make REST calls and CSOM calls into the SharePoint host and be authenticated as a particular app identity. And then SharePoint will also be able to say, oh, given this app identity, do you have permissions to do what you're trying to do? If so, you'll succeed. If not, you get access denied. Okay. So that takes us to the end of our session. I think we're right at time, so thank you very much for coming. I wish I could answer questions, but I got to run to another room. Thank you.